Well, very simply, this war is not going to end because Putin doesn't want to end it. I mean, let's just look at it very simply. Russia and Vladimir Putin are the invading force. Ukraine are the defending force. This is like kindergarten. I mean, everybody is speaking so respectfully about what's going on as if this is like foreign policy. This is kindergarten.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
Ukraine's chief negotiator, Andriy Yermak, in an interview with The Atlantic, he said that not a single sane person today would sign a document to give up territory. So as long as Zelensky is president, no one should count on us giving up territory. He will not sign away territory. The Constitution prohibits this. Nobody can do that unless they want to go against the Ukrainian Constitution and the Ukrainian people. So, Bill, this in conjunction with the fact that Putin, while speaking to reporters on Thursday, said that Russia would continue its aggression until the last Ukrainian dies in order to get what he wants. He said Ukrainian troops must withdraw from the territories they hold and then the fighting will cease. If they don't leave, then we shall achieve this by force. So your reaction to that?
Well, it doesn't sound like there's much peace negotiation going on from the Russian side, for sure. I mean, the thing about this, which is so interesting, is that I don't think Putin, even with this 28-point, quote, peace plan, ever had any intention of stopping the war. It's been his objective all along to take all of Ukraine, and that hasn't changed. He hasn't modified that in any way. And it's not because Putin needs Ukraine. It's not because Ukraine in any way helps him geographically or anything else. The reason why Putin wants to be at war with Ukraine is that if he's not at war with Ukraine, then the Russian people would say, well, wait a second, you've been around for 25 years and, life is not so great here. It's not good. You step outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg and most people don't even have indoor toilets. I mean, it's an insanity that you have a country as rich as Russia and most people are living below the poverty line. And so what Putin has got to be afraid of is that the people will say, well, wait a second, you're the guy responsible for all this horrific lifestyle that we have. Why haven't you improved it in 25 years? And, maybe you're not the guy. And that's what he's most afraid of. And so what do you do if you're in that situation, if you're Vladimir Putin? Well, he says, well, actually, there's these terrible, evil guys next door that are so bad to us, and they're Nazis, and they're doing all this terrible stuff to Russian-speaking people. Why don't we invade them? And people who don't really have much sophistication say, yeah, those are bad guys, and we support the president, and let's invade them. And so Putin needs this war in order to stay in power. And by the way, if he's not in power, he ends up getting hung from a lamppost. And so this is very clear what Putin's up to, and he's not going to negotiate any peace with anybody.
Well, Bill, it's not even about staying in power, but as you said, it's a little bit more sinister than that, in the sense that the Russian people will turn on him in a more sinister way, in the fact that he will be targeted, he will be killed.
There's no question, and he understands that, and so his quote that he announced about the last Ukrainian, he should actually change the word to Russian. That in order for him to stay alive, he'll send the last Russian into their death in order so that he can stay in power and stay alive.
Well, let's get into how the US is impacted by this, their involvement in this. So you've got one country saying that they will continue to kill everyone until they get this territory that they stole. And then you've got another country saying that they won't give up territory that is theirs. So when you look at these quotes, Bill, does it make you question the Trump administration's understanding of the war and Putin's intentions when you have this leaked audio recording of Steve Witkoff, not just coaching the Kremlin on how to speak to Trump, but telling them that he's always believed that Russia wants a peace deal?
Well, I think we're all being pretty naive saying, what does Trump want, a peace deal or whatever? Trump doesn't want a peace deal. Trump wants to be doing business with Putin. He's pretty much said so. And you've got his son-in-law, who's the big, fund manager who took $2 billion from the Saudis now, dealing with the Russians. He doesn't care about peace. What he's looking for, what Trump is looking for, is what leverage does he have to force Ukraine to surrender. That's what he's thinking about. And he's thinking that first he thought if he cut off military aid to Ukraine, that would cause them to surrender. But the Europeans continue to support Ukraine, and there's the frozen assets, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. Then he says, okay, well, I'm going to cut off military intelligence to Ukraine because the Ukrainians get a lot of early warning about Russian missiles and troop movements and stuff like that. And that's definitely leverage. That if they cut that off, then more Ukrainians will die. But that's not enough leverage for Ukraine to capitulate and become occupied by Russia because they understand what occupation means. Occupation means rape for the women, torture and murder for the men, and kidnapping for the children. And the Ukrainians would rather be at war than subject themselves to that kind of horror.
The last time you and I spoke about Trump's inner circle advising him on Ukraine, we spoke about how Keith Kellogg announced that reports suggested that he was planning on stepping down in his role in January. And we spoke about Steve Witkoff, and your interpretation was that it's not, for you and I to decide who is really in Trump's corner. But so much has happened since you and I spoke about, Steve Witkoff and his role as envoy tasked with getting a peace deal. Now, what's happened in the last few days is that several Republicans in Trump's team, his orbit, have called for him to fire Steve Witkoff, believing that he does not have Ukraine's best interests, that he's very pro-Russia. So what do you think about that now? Do you think that Trump should tell him that he's got to step away from his post?
Well, I mean, Trump generally doesn't get pushed around by members of his party. He's the one doing the pushing. Except in certain circumstances. We saw that with the Epstein files, that a few prominent Republicans, Marjorie Taylor Greene and others, were able to get him to roll over. And I think Ukraine is another one of those issues. I mean, you see three prominent Republicans speaking loudly and speaking publicly about this. There's a lot of other Republicans that are also on Ukraine's side. A lot of Republicans, in fact. Just among the American Republicans, not even members of Congress, 83% of them saw the Witkoff, Kirill Dmitriev proposal as being horrible. Only 17% supported that. And so I think that it's not a minor issue in the Republican Party, and it could actually be some type of red line in terms of foreign policy. I think that it's America has historically been the most stalwart when it came to standing up against the Soviets and standing up against the Russians. And so it's completely strange, out of character, un-American for this new approach to be taken.
And I think it's important to note that polling in the last 6, 7, 8 months has suggested that Americans are becoming more pro-Ukrainian than they were under the Biden administration, and want the Trump administration to be investing more money in aid, investing more money in intelligence, and to even showing a little bit more support. But Bill, Politico reported this week that Marco Rubio told European officials that the US wants Ukraine to sign a peace deal before Washington agrees to any sort of security guarantee. So this happened while Europe had been working on their own robust security pact for post-war Ukraine. So for the US to hold back on this security agreement, what does that say to you?
Well, the whole thing is just a big nonsense. There's not going to be any agreement on any of these terms. There's not going to be a peace agreement. A peace agreement requires Zelensky and Putin to sign an agreement. Zelensky's not going to give up territory, and Putin's not going to give up the war. And so it's just a red herring to talk about security guarantees when there's no agreement that's going to be signed. I'm afraid that this particular war, Trump is not going to be able to end. This war will end when either Ukraine wins or Russia wins. It's not going to end because Trump thinks that he can sort of step in and force one side to capitulate.
We've seen so much when it comes to concessions and what this war is really banking on, but the last week really indicates that, well, I wondered if you agree that it will come down to territorial concessions and whether there won't be a security pact, whether there won't be a peace deal, because neither side can agree to territorial concessions.
Well, very simply, this war is not going to end because Putin doesn't want to end it. I mean, let's just look at it very simply. Russia and Vladimir Putin are the invading force. Ukraine are the defending force. Ukraine wants to stop the war, but they're not going to allow themselves to be invaded. And so it's just as simple as that. Putin can singularly stop this war by just not being at war, but he's chosen not to, and he will continue to choose not to. And by the way, all this talk about peace negotiations is all just a way of delaying the two things that Putin doesn't want to have happen. The first is that he doesn't want the his oil to be sanctioned in China, India, and Turkey. And second, he doesn't want his sovereign central bank reserves to be confiscated in Brussels. And by putting up this fake peace agreement discussion, it puts everything into play. And just yesterday, the Belgian government wrote a letter saying they don't want to allow the money to be confiscated because it might mess up the peace deal. And Lindsey Graham's piece of legislation, which would punish China, India, and Turkey with 500% tariffs for buying Russian oil, that's not going to go anywhere because Trump is going to say, why would we sanction Russia when we're in the middle of a peace negotiation? And so Putin has achieved his objectives. He's got 3 or 4 months of runway to carry on with his war. He's hoping that we're going to capitulate in those 3 or 4 months. By the way, he's suffering himself, but he understands that he can tolerate a lot more pain, like 100 times more pain than we can in the West, because he's a dictator. In the West, we all live in democracies.
And we'll get into that response from Belgium in a minute. But on the note of sanctions, Bill, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is set to meet with Putin today in Moscow to discuss Ukraine's future and secure Hungarian energy supply. So it comes as Orban has repeatedly claimed that Ukraine is not a sovereign country. He's argued that the state depends on Western aid and that therefore should not be treated as an independent, self-standing nation. So Trump recently exempted Hungary from sanctions when the two leaders met in the White House. This is despite the fact that Hungary is a big buyer of Russian oil and gas. I think there was about 8.5 million tons of crude oil imported from Russia this year, alongside billions of cubic meters of Russian gas. So looking at this relationship between Putin and Orban, why would Trump exempt such a staunch Putin ally?
Well, because he's a staunch Trump ally as well. And Trump is not on Ukraine's side. He's on Putin's side. And he's on Orban's side. And moreover, what's completely hypocritical about this whole thing is he exempts Hungary from buying and says you can continue to buy Russian oil. And then he pounds the table and says, how do we end this war if the Europeans are still buying Russian oil? Well, who's the Europeans? It's Hungary, who he exempted. It's just absurd. The whole thing is just, this is like kindergarten. Everybody is speaking so respectfully about what's going on as if this is like foreign policy. This is kindergarten.
Speaking of, we mentioned Zelensky's top negotiator, Andriy Yermak, before. So the Ukrainian anti-corruption investigators have raided his home and office as part of a major probe into an alleged multi-million-dollar kickbacks in the energy sector. Is this a big deal, Bill? This is only broken in the last hour, so we'll learn more as the day goes on.
Well, Ukraine and Russia, when I was first when I was living in Russia and investing in the former Soviet Union, they were equal in terms of corruption. They were both the most horrifically corrupt places. Neither was better or worse than the other. They were all terribly corrupt. Russia continues to be the most corrupt cesspool on the planet. And Ukraine has improved a lot, but it doesn't mean that they've rewired their neural pathways and they just went from like total corruption to total honesty. Yeah, there's some corruption in Ukraine, and it's very bad because that's one of the talking points about not supporting Ukraine, saying, well, they're so corrupt. Well, yeah, they're corrupt, but they're not. I would say on a scale of 1 to 100, Ukrainians are now at 12 or 13, whereas the Russians are at 99 in terms of corruption. And yes, any corruption that happens there is absolute, should be shut down and the people punished with absolute severity. But for all these people, particularly the Russians, to be arguing that Ukraine is such a corrupt place, well, they should get their own house in order and return the $1 trillion that they stole before they start criticizing anybody else.
We're nearly 4 years into this war. When this first started, a lot of military analysts, anyone would think that, Ukraine wasn't going to survive a few months. But we're now 4 years later and a lot has changed. So shouldn't Trump, being in the position of being the most powerful man in the world, shouldn't he know that by now Russia has proved that it isn't strong enough to take Ukraine? It's only captured 1% of land since November 2022. So why isn't Trump convincing Putin that he doesn't have the strength, the capability, the resources to take Ukraine?
because he wants to do business with Putin, and he wants to. Putin is the guy. Trump likes guys with money. He loves the Saudis, and all of a sudden there's like Trump Towers in Saudi Arabia. He loves the Qataris. He gets a $400 million 747 as a gift. Yeah, they have a lot of money. He loves the Emiratis. They're doing all sorts of business, investing in Trump coins and Trump media and so on and so forth. And the Russians are the kind of people that have a lot of money, and he wants to be able to do business with the Russians, I'm
But
sure.
what kind of business can he do? I mean, you and I have spoken about the only people that are really rich in Russia are about 1,000 people.
Yeah, well, those 1,000 people can do a lot of business with him. I think that's what he's hoping to get. I mean, I think that's what he's up to. And so he's not trying to end the war because he cares about humanity. He's trying to end the war so he and his group of people can open up personal business dealings, not even United States business dealings, but personal business dealings with the Russians. And so we're in a situation. This is like unprecedented situation where the foreign policy of the United States is driven by a guy who wants to do business and for himself, and he's totally exempt from any type of prosecution for that. For doing that, and he has the pardoning power to pardon anybody below him who he cares about, who also benefits from that. And so it's I don't think we've ever seen a situation like this. It's hard to imagine how it's all gonna how it's all gonna play out. But it basically means that the United States is not a friend of Ukraine as much as everybody is desperately trying to get the United States on board. The United States is clearly trying to do Putin's bidding, and Europe and all the other allies of Ukraine need to step up further. And the one way that Europe and the other allies can do that is to confiscate the Russian central bank reserves, because with that money, America becomes sort of an irrelevance. Trump can dump his Oval Office desk as much as he wants, but at the end of the day, if Ukraine has the money, they'll fight back and they'll continue to defend themselves. And at some point, Putin may collapse from this whole thing.
We'll get into that, those reserves in a minute, Bill, those frozen assets. I want to read out a quote from David French, who wrote this in the New York Times. I thought it was an interesting point. He wrote that the fundamental objective of American diplomacy and the fundamental aim of American aid should be to deny Putin control of Ukraine. Rubio seems to understand this imperative, but much of the rest of the administration does not. If Trump uses the considerable economic, military and diplomatic power of the US to coerce Ukraine into risking its independence, a ceasefire wouldn't be a diplomatic achievement, it would be a national shame. Actually, it would be worse than that. It would be a strategic disaster. We'd teach our NATO allies that we're an unreliable partner. We'd teach Putin that brute military force works, and we'd place NATO's eastern flank at profound immediate risk. We would have increased the chances of a wider war. What's your reaction to that?
I think every single thing he said is true, and the most important part of this thing is that it sends a message to the Chinese and others that you can go take Taiwan and all sorts of other terrible things. I mean, it's so important that that Ukraine stands up to Putin. And what I would say is that there's been a big sort of campaign from the MAGA crowd to say that Ukraine is weak. They're on the verge of collapse. It's all very terrible. Give up now. And that's what this guy Driscoll said, the general who is a friend of J.D. Vance, who was sent out to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians know better than Driscoll about this. Driscoll would have been one to say that the Russians were going to win in 3 days. And at the end of the day, Ukraine will determine their situation. America has already stepped out financially. If America steps out from an intelligence sharing standpoint, more Ukrainians will die, but it doesn't mean Ukraine will end up losing the war. And then at that point, America completely loses its leverage because there's nothing left for them to threaten Ukraine with.
I thought another interesting article in the New York Times was, you and I spoke late last week about this 28-point plan that was leaked to Axios and to the Financial Times that was a heavily pro-Russia plan proposal written and drafted by the US and Russia in conjunction, leaving Ukraine out of the equation. But the New York Times' article is a timeline of when it came, when this proposal was leaked, and the fact that European officials found out about it through newspaper headlines the way you and I found out about it. So here's what it said. It said, senior European officials had known the Trump administration was working on some kind of plan, but nothing that favoured Russia to this extent. When it surfaced, they realised that Europe had been cut out of the Trump administration's efforts to end the continent's biggest land war since World War II. So This prompted a race against time for European officials to make contact, to meet in Geneva with US officials to try and swing the proposal back to being Ukraine favoured. Rubio's tune apparently changed over a few days, and Europe called the talks a success. But the fact of the matter is that Europe had been left out of the loop. Dan Driscoll's reasoning for this bill was that he said that there were too many cooks. What's your response to this? I mean, this is a war in Europe on Europe's doorstep, and they left them out.
Well, I mean, it's again, this is kindergarten. It doesn't make any sense. You can't negotiate a major peace deal if you don't include the parties to the peace, Ukrainians and the Europeans, and so it's not going to happen. I think that again, the purpose of this is just to distract everybody from the fact that we were about to sanction the Russian oil and that we were going to confiscate the Russian central bank reserves. I don't think there was ever anybody who knows the story well who understands that there was not going to be any peace from this unreasonable proposal that was you said it was drafted with the Russians and the Americans. No, it was drafted in Russian by the Russians, translated from Russian into English, handed to Steve Witkoff, who Trump probably didn't read the thing, and then handed it to the Ukrainians. This is a Russian demands, not a U.S. Peace proposal.
But the fact of the matter is that the US is still in NATO, so there are expectations for the United States and their part in this. So German's foreign minister said that Russia is preparing the capability to attack a NATO country by 2029 at the latest. That's what intelligence is showing them, that Moscow is rebuilding its military and economy for a wider war, not just for Ukraine. He added that the threat is already a reality, with Russia conducting hybrid attacks and military build-up that Europe must not underestimate. So if that's the case, Bill, the US under Article 5 would have to intervene. So European allies and the US can't be divided right now.
Well, they are divided, and furthermore, Trump has made numerous statements questioning whether the U.S. would support Article 5, whether the U.S. would step in. He says it depends on how much money people are spending on their military efforts and their defense. And so, I mean, Article 5 of NATO, and NATO itself is a voluntary sort of mutual defense organization, and it requires everybody to act with goodwill and to be reliable. And so it's not even clear that NATO even exists in the form that we think it does, because it's not clear whether the United States would step in to support its NATO allies if they were attacked. I mean, they're being attacked with, the 16 drones went into Poland. There's airspace being violated in Estonia. There's internet cables being dug up in the Baltic Sea, and on and on and on. I don't see any realistic possibility that the United States would step into that. And so part of the problem that we have right now, and this is a big problem, is that Europe, on one hand, understands that America has sort of left the table when it comes to transatlantic security, but on the other hand, is hoping and praying that maybe they'll come back. And so everybody is sort of being very polite to Trump and praising him and giving him all deference and respect, because nobody wants him to openly say NATO is over, because that means all sorts of terrible things for the rest of Europe. But that's kind of the direction it's going in, and that's the really scary part about what's happening, is that we could end up in World War III if the United States says we're not interested anymore in European security, we're not interested in NATO. And then Putin would love that, because he could then attack a NATO country and hope that the NATO minus America is not strong enough to fight back.
Ukraine is in critical need of funding. There's expectations that they could run out of money for the next few months, and the Coalition of the Willing has promised as of late meetings that they will continue to fund. The EU is also debating a $140 billion loan for Ukraine which would be the frozen Russian assets that you and I have spoken about for months now. But there are voices in Europe that have been warning against potential consequences. So you mentioned Belgium before. Belgium, where the money is held, is arguing that giving these frozen Russian assets to Ukraine could derail peace talks. But Bill, this is the main way in which Europe steps up, moves away from any reliance on the US and helps to save Ukraine. So can you kind of walk our audience through why this is so important that the EU signs off on this. I think the date that they meet is December 18th.
Well, at the end of the day, America supplied 40% of the aid to Ukraine. Europe supplied 60%. When Trump came into power, he cut off the military aid for Ukraine, which means that there's a 40% gap to be filled. That can be filled. It can either not be filled, and if it's not filled, then the Ukrainians will run out of weapons and other things they need to fight back against the Russians. Or it can be filled by European taxpayers paying more taxes, which I think is very unrealistic in this environment where everybody is suffering with their budgets. Or it can be filled by taking the money from Vladimir Putin. And that's the obvious thing. That's going to happen. It's going to be a fractious, ugly discussion. The Belgians don't want it to happen because they're scared. The Europeans should provide Belgium with some kind of mutual legal guarantee that if there's a challenge, that everybody will look at it together and fight it together. But at the end of the day, it's kind of hard for me to imagine any scenario where that money doesn't get released, because that would mean huge problems for Ukraine, and it would lead to huge problems for Europe, because Putin has already shown that he's ready to attack Europe. He's doing it in a hybrid way now. He may be doing it in a more explicit way later.
So, Bill Browder, thank you for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you.